All right, Pat, we are live. We're here with Patrick Benoit. Pat, thank you very much for joining me. And in the description, we've got some intros. So I just love to get straight into the conversation. How does that sound, my friend?
That's great. I appreciate you having me here. Thank you.
Beautiful, absolute pleasure. No, it's me that really desperately appreciates it because we want to build a community of BISO, CISOs, cybersecurity professionals for cybersecurity professionals, and so volunteering your time like this is part of building that community. And look, it's the WannaCry anniversary last week, right? And look what's happening in Costa Rica and with triple extortion ransomware. We have to build community more than build kingdoms and fiefdoms. It has to be one global community in order for us to combat threat actors. Now, we'll get into that, but Pat and I were having a great dialogue just in the preamble up to this, and I thought that might be a nice way for us to kick it off because here we are. So what are we? Middle of May 2022. We're coming out of the pandemic. It's great. There's a few places like museums that still require masks. I'm so happy that nothing. I took some international plane rides last week and the week before domestically, no masks. It's like, oh, at last, everybody seems to be safe and relaxing on this thing now. But it might be okay, bearing in mind sensitivity to people that had a very rough time during this pandemic, to start talking about some of the good things and the celebrations. And this is what Pat and I were saying. COVID proved that people can work from home. And you brought up something great, Pat, the industrial age era of work in the modern digital era. Please explain that to the audience. That was great.
Well, consider, if you will, that we had 100 years of industrial age, give or take. I'll use round number, give or take, and we've in the last 30 to 50 years become far more oriented in the information age. And the same rules that apply for mechanizing an industrial type factory process do not necessarily apply to the information age. You had to be in the factory to put the bolt on the end of the screw. You had to be in the factory to punch the time clock and then to walk out when you were done. Most people lived closer to the urban environments where those factories resided. So you didn't have the transportation facilitation that we have nowadays. So a lot of that, and so our ideas have to change. We have to stop thinking about a factory and start thinking about an information center. And so that's why the virtual world works so well now with information workers. We don't need them to be in the office. We don't need them to punch a clock. We also have the change in the millennial and post-millennial attitude towards how work is. We came from I'm the old guy here. We came from the 8 to 5 kind of scenario and grew up that way because that was a factory mentality. Most younger generations, though, work. They'll come in and work for a couple hours, and they'll take an hour off to go work out somewhere. They'll work for 3, 4, 5 more hours, and then they'll go get something to eat. And they'll work for a couple more hours, and they'll go get a coffee. And they'll do that in 24-hour cycles. They don't have a set schedule. So we need to start changing our metrics to get the work done. What kind of productivity do you have in getting the work done, regardless of how much time it takes? And I'm thinking in terms of a person in the seat time, which was never a good measure anyway.
Yeah, that's right. Because, and I was saying about meritocracy, right? It's meritocracy in its purest form, because if we can figure out how to measure our information age workers based on KPIs for the actual work versus the time it takes to get the work done, surely somebody that can get 8 hours of work done in 6 hours should actually be rewarded by having 8 hours of, let's say, pay, as it were. But you're not having 8 hours of pay. You're having pay based on achieving company goals, these metrics. And then that person is either free to work out a little bit more, or maybe work even harder at the organization to get a promotion. That is true meritocracy. Meritocracy, yes. And so this leads us, and I think society has pulled us in this direction. The pandemic has really bashed us, the last remnants of people who, let's say, didn't see the value of that, in that direction. And so now we've got a much bigger cybersecurity problem to solve, because people are working in this sort of remote fashion. They should be, their KPIs are tied to performance, and therefore the performance must be tied to the responsibilities in their organization. And so they need access to systems specific to their responsibility, the zero trust model, right? So that they can do their job anytime they like, and we can bolt down the things that their KPIs don't necessarily touch. Now, this is why I'm very excited to speak to you. You're the second BISO, or person that has a BISO responsibility in your role over at this giant global real estate company that you work for, because I think now we're having to start to realize it's not just about securing those remote workers, but how can we make security a value add to those remote workers, to the business? Yeah. What are your thoughts and comments on that, Pat?
Absolutely. I first wanted to point out that you talk about, we talk in terms of people, and they're at home now and it's different and there's more security and yada, yada, yada. We have to do things differently. But we all too often forget hackers are people too. That's the new bumper sticker, right? Hackers are people too. So these folks that are out there, whether they're doing good or doing bad, they have the same kind of access that we do. They're working 24 hours in weird times. They're geographically dispersed all over the world. So we need to remember that they're no different than anybody else that we have there, except that they have a skill set that most of us may or may not have. But in terms of the security into business as a value add, that's critically important. I think the CISO role is evolving much like the CIO role evolved over time. If you remember, or maybe you don't, I'm old enough to remember back in the day where we had an IT director, and that was the most you had. You had a technology director, and every once in a while the chief finance officer might ask the technology director to tell him enough information so he could sound impressive in front of the board or the ELT. Now we've seen that evolve to the point where the CIO has a seat at the table. CIO is part of the ELT or CTO, whichever is the case. Right. CISO still, though, generally works for the CIO or a CTO or right. some second level down, another level down. And it's because, in my opinion only, that we haven't proven our business savvy yet. We haven't proven that we can, bring business value and that we think in terms of business, because we're still considered super techie. So that's what we have to change our ability to influence what's going on. And we do that by accepting the fact that we only have two table stakes to deal with. We have to reduce risk for the company so they can do business, and we have to help them enhance revenue so they can do business. If we can't do those two things, we're not meeting table stakes. And so what's the point? Then we start looking at ideas like, is there some way that we can actually monetize security? How do we put a security person on the sales team? How do we move a security representative from being under security and under the CIO to actually living down like a business analyst, living down on the sales pursuit team, on the account management team, which is really what the role of the BISO is, in my opinion.
Give us some examples of that, because that's frankly an outrageous and wonderful claim. I know a lot of CISOs that would love to figure out how they can get some of their, let's say, deputies to move around the organization, especially onto the revenue side, so that their value can be recognized.
Sure. And I think it starts in some ways by having somebody that can prove that value can be recognized. Having a BISO has accepted the fact that they're a salesperson is a big step right there. And I tell CISOs all the time, look, as soon as you decide to take the step over to the dark side and that you are a salesperson, no matter how you slice it, that's your role, is to sell. Now, you may be selling security as a value add, you may be selling yourself for a promotion, you may be selling whatever it is, but you're a salesperson. Just accept it. Let's move on. Once you do that's that relationship and that character change. You have to think differently about how you organize your team for that. Then I don't think it's that big a deal. The next step is, how do you get the businesses to recognize the value of the BISO and to maybe pay for the BISO? If you're building out a team that's supporting everything they're doing to drive revenue, why can't they be supported by that revenue directly instead of an overhead expense? So now you start with chargebacks and stuff.
Give me an example of how a BISO can take security and make it a value add. Like I still see it as a black box of debt.
Well, to begin with, in the beginning, the BISO really shows value by being and I want to say it as a portal, not a gateway between the business and the security office. And in that way, you actively teach the business, hey, if you need anything, if you ever hear the word client in any discussion, then you should come to me, the BISO, and I will help you get what you need. So now they don't have to think about and they don't chase emails and chase people to figure out who can answer a question for them. They come to me and my team, and then we get them to the right people. You do the same thing on the backside. You talk to your engineers and your technology folks. You say, look, if you need anything to do with a client, don't bother going out and looking for it yourself. Just come to me. We will help you get to the right place. That's the first value.
Like what? What would a client be looking for that a BISO can provide financial value to the company with?
Well, I mean, the first is going to be all of that third-party assurance. That's where the client's going to come to the BISO first, is with third-party assurance. Are you taking care of our data? Are you doing all the right things? Make us feel, and then the big value for sales pursuit is make us feel comfortable that you are, so that we're comfortable signing on the dotted line. And a BISO can do that as part of a sales team way better than a sales team can do it by themselves. That's the first step.
Right. I love the fact that you're using the word sales, because it's a dirty word for CISOs, right? It's a dirty word for a lot of people. And so if you think of it that way, then suddenly I'm saying to myself, well, okay, if a client's coming with a problem, tell me about it. I'm the BISO, tell me about it. Maybe I can even create a solution that I'm going to sell to that client, because, hey, look, the client's got a problem. I have to have whatever, GDPR, I have to have data centers over here, whatnot, whatever, right? Okay, great. If you have to have that, let me solve this problem for you. And, here's the bill that comes with that, since it's important to you. That's sales.
Right, exactly. And then you can start thinking really outside the box, depending on your business model, because every business is going to be a little bit different. But if you have a really strong, say you're a B2B type business where most of your direct customers are actually other businesses, then maybe you have an opportunity to look at the breakout of your customer base and say, hey, we know we have a certain size of customer that probably can't do security at the same level that they would like to, but maybe we can extend our capability through, let's use the example of maybe a SOC. Maybe we can extend our SOC capability out to our smaller customers as a value add proposition, not our primary source of revenue. We're not trying to be a security company, but you know what? We have all these other companies that are going to handle our data, and we're going to handle their data. So maybe we can offer them some of our services, and we get a volume. We build volume in terms of discounting potentially for cost, and we extend that out. And give them a value-added service, much like an MSP would.
Yeah. That's actually how Amazon Web Services started. So Bezos is selling all this stuff, trinkets, whatever, and making okay money, let's say. And then some genius in his organization just paid attention to the fact that all these lights in our data center light up on Cyber Monday. The rest of the year, this is empty real estate. We should rent this out. And that was Amazon Web Services. And it turned into a much more colossal giant of a revenue intake than the actual selling of trinkets.
Well, yeah. And now let's throw that back to the history of computing in general. Does anybody except me remember the original model was time sharing, and IBM built a business on time sharing?
What was that? No, I mean, look, I've been in the game a while.
That was exactly AWS, but they had their own mainframe stuff, and you could buy slices of compute power from them to do the processing you needed to do. It was time shared environments. That was early computing.
So was it because there was no bandwidth? Was it because there was no bandwidth that didn't
Right.
take off? Right.
Right. We didn't have the extension of the mini and microcomputers out to the world. Microcomputers were very new, very young, and not very prevalent or out there. And so, you know, you had bigger companies that were offering, and now like we have co-location services for data centers. It was a similar thing, but it was more
Wow.
like what we now would call infrastructure as a service, or you know, platform as a service, or you know, software as a service.
Timing is
We
everything.
rebranded it. We just
Yeah.
rebranded it and made it a
Okay.
specialization.
Wow, that's very interesting. Well, and I had mentioned it a little earlier in our preamble that Steve Jobs made computers friendly to humans, because I think you're going back to the pre-friendliness, that big
Yep.
IBM mainframe. You know, you had to be the guy in the white lab coat. That's how the ads were. Do you remember the advertisements?
Right.
There was a guy in a coat. You know, the whole thing was a very intimidating experience, right? It's only
Well,
the
let's think about how
brainiacs.
they used to sell it too. In the beginning, I can remember being on old mainframes years ago, and when you bought that big mainframe at whatever cost, you got literally a book room full of manuals to operate on, and it had told you everything you needed to know.
Yeah.
Then we went through a cycle where it was somebody figured out, well, that's money that we can sell. So then you got a small set of manuals with your computer, and you had to buy the additional manuals.
And
And that
training.
went on for a while. And then all of a sudden, with the proliferation of the internet and everything else, it became, we can get everything online anyway. So
Right.
most of the stuff you could just get as part of their support now.
Right. Yeah. We give content away for free, which is what you and I are doing right now, right?
Right.
You've got a lot to do in life. You're the vice president of security for a very, very important, massive firm. You've got a lot of other things to do, but you're spending an hour giving content away for free in order to build community, in order to build brand awareness, blah, blah, all that stuff.
Exactly.
So yeah, content is free now. Yeah. Yeah. Talk about timing. How interesting is that? You know, and also, you know, the technology had to get to a place where there were just a few people in sort of lab coats, metaphorically speaking. Nowadays, are you familiar with Discord, the server, right? So it's not, nowadays you can throw up a bunch of servers and get bots to do automatic things just by point and click, right? That point and click GUI.
Sure.
That's actually the defining factor for a lot of companies, right? If you got ahead on the ease of use for technology, this was the Steve Jobs thing, right? You know, this is the thing. If you get a point and click GUI as opposed to line command, and I always like to say this, if security isn't simple, it isn't followed. I get that creating algorithms that are very difficult to crack, like the password problem we have, alphanumeric capitals, etc. People can't remember them, right? Security is complicated in that case. So passwords are still one of the highest things that threat actors can use, your weak passwords, repeated passwords, these kinds of things, to penetrate an organization. Because security is complex. That's a complex thing. Whereas a passphrase of, let's say, 20 letters that you can remember, this is Eddie Doyle's password, right? I can remember that. It's simple and it's just as effective. So that's our balance, wouldn't you say, as a CISO, BISO, complexity versus simplicity?
Well, yeah, and too often what's happened over time is that I'm almost soapboxing a little bit here, is that back in the day, everybody was a generalist in technology. I mean, if you got somebody that was in technology, they generally knew how to code, they knew how to run the machine, they knew binary, they could speak hex and octal, and and do the whole thing. They could change equipment if they needed to. And over time, we developed specializations. And in developing specializations, we often forget, just like fashion, everything comes back again. And so, as an example, we talked about factory and industrial age versus information age. Well, one of the things I like to teach my team is this idea of everything needs to get pushed to a factory process. So you take some new process and you document it. Somebody at a very skilled SME documents a tier 3 as an example, and they're working on it. They figure out how all the nuances go, what the problems are, how to automate it and do different things. And they document it real well, and then we push it down a level to a less experienced person. Let them operate it on it a while, see if it breaks, see what goes on, continue to automate, and we push it down another level to a less experienced person. that now maybe is just following a checklist and doing exactly what they have to do, but they're learning as they go. And eventually we push it down to the lowest level being fully automated through bots or whatever the case is.
Wow.
And then that frees up these higher skilled SMEs to work on the next new thing, to figure it out, document it, push it down, figure it out, document it. That's a factory process now.
Right. So what you're saying there is that factory process is a good thing in order to create structure, but we need to work within a unfactory process. I'm not sure of the terminology there, but we need to work within a process of, let's say, the digital age, not that 9 to 5. So what we take from the industrial era is that structure, that heavy, here are the walls, here's the foundation.
Work.
Yeah. In documentation, not in actual hours worked and how we work in metrics.
Right. Exactly.
Right. Yeah, that's fantastic. That's really important. Yeah. But comments on security being simple and yet just as effective rather than complicated and not followed, because I think it's in our nature to believe if it's complicated. Let's take the password example. I do rant on this one, so my audience is going to be a little bit kind of like we've heard this, Eddie, so I'll make it quick. But the guy when we had the problem of putting passwords together, put the most secure password together. I forget the fella's name. He was a university professor with a PhD in linguistics and algorithms, blah, blah, right? And he put a team together with a QWERTY keyboard. How can you create the most secure password? Well, he came up with it. Capitals, non-caps, symbols, numbers, all that. Right. Okay. He wrote an op-ed, an apology letter in the Times years ago to say, I'm really sorry, I screwed up. That was wrong. Because he said, while it was the most secure thing, it wasn't followed. At first, we had sticky notes. You remember that? Before we had password lockers and computers remembering our passwords. So people would put a sticky note on their monitor. And so, no security there. People are repeating passwords. And so we've built technology to stop people from repeating corporate passwords with personal passwords. I mean, it goes on, right? Because we created a problem. We can't get out of it because the systems we've made require that alphanumeric nonsense, as opposed to this is Eddie's password, which is a really long string. And let's say I just capitalize every new word. That is apparently, because he also ran, when he wrote this apology, that is apparently just as secure. And actually, I think it was the University of Columbia did an experiment where they showed that a minimum 26-digit passphrase is more secure than any alphanumeric password, right? Because it's really long. I think that's what you need for, let's say, a Bitcoin locker, right? You need a passphrase. So those guys have taken it very seriously. So we created this problem. Okay, that's probably a BISO responsibility, is to solve that problem within our organizations. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, we forget our basic lessons. We start with things like moderation in all things, balance in all things, yin and yang, whichever culture you want to take it from or philosophy you want to drive from. And we forget to keep balanced the two opposing forces. There's duality in everything. So in this case, the duality is security against convenience. That's the duality that exists. And yes, the BISO can be a part of that, but unfortunately, the BISO likely won't be setting the rules for passwords. What the BISO will be doing, though, is encouraging as an example, passphrases or using password managers and things like that where possible. Going to passwordless technology, multi-factor and bio and facial and all those kinds of things like that. And what's the pluses and minuses of doing that, because you'll have to get that executive buy-in at the line of business.
Right. Now, how does one, this is perfect. I love this, Pip, because how does one measure the value of that? So this is not the BISO being a salesperson creating a solution for an end user and selling it to them. Right. This is the BISO creating efficiency within an organization. Let's take a big outfit like a Bank of America, 200,000-300,000 employees. It would be brilliant if you could measure the time saved of all those employees faffing about with passwords by giving them some kind of biometric solution. Okay, great, right? That I think academically we know that would be a good exercise. How do we truly measure to the CEO of the organization that if I make us passwordless, I've saved us 3 minutes per person per day every year. I mean, it's worth something. How do we monetize? How do we put value?
And Eddie, you just kind of stumbled across the dirty little secret that exists out there with statistics, is that you can make statistics say anything you want them to say. That's the dirty little secret. So oftentimes when I used to, because I had my graduate work had a lot of statistics in it, and somebody would come to me and say, hey, we want you to do statistics on X, Y, Z. My first question would always be to the leader, what do you want the outcome to be? Because I can make the statistics work out to prove what you want to prove, unless I'm building something for a specific end. So I think, and the other part of that dirty little secret is, you've seen in legal circles where if I say this happened and you say, well, no, this happened, and then I pull out a notebook and on it I have written date, time, this happened. Guess who wins?
Right.
I do every time, because I wrote it down. It doesn't mean that it actually happened. It just means I wrote it down. So the same kind of thing applies to, in some ways, proving out value. Value is a perceived thing. Quality is whatever the person believes it to be. So I need to understand what the business leader's view of quality or value is, and then I need to be able to translate that the metric, whatever we use for the metric or the formula, into that value. And as long as I establish a formula that has reasonable basis, I mean, I'm not talking about being disingenuous or lying about things. You create a formula that, although may not be 100% scientifically sound, it has reasonable basis, and then that reasonable basis will produce some measure of value that's important to the leader, and then you start measuring. That's how you get there.
And that's the job of the BISO, right?
That's part of the job of the BISO. Yes, absolutely. And he will enlist, she will enlist whomever they need to in order to finish that out. In the end, you come back to marketing and sales. I'm trying to sell a concept to a leader, and so I have to be a salesman again.
Right. And you have to, as you say, not be disingenuous about the numbers, but you can make the numbers work. Being a former Brit, I'm a bit of a fan of Winston Churchill. And so he's got a great quote on statistics. During the war, they could have obviously, look, propaganda is a big thing, right? And the Nazis obviously had propaganda within the UK. The UK government also had their own propaganda for their own people. You take what happened at Bletchley Park when Alan Turing had finally cracked Enigma. They didn't tell anybody. They let Coventry get bombed. But what would they tell the people? They had to have a dance. And Churchill was very good at this. And a great leader tells the truth and is able to, I don't want to quite say spin a story, but is able to inspire the people in spite of terrible truths there. Now, his quote was, there are lies, there are damn lies, and then there are statistics. Right? I've always remembered that and thought that, you can make the numbers work either way. But that's not quite what we're saying. We're saying we need to have you were saying a reasonable measurement of success to make the business secure and create business continuity.
Right.
It's a very gray world. Hey, Pat?
It is. And so you get into we're going to go through all these different little quotes and philosophies and stuff. But, you get to the point of also, don't let perfection be the enemy of good in whatever form of translation you take that quote. And this is a perfect example of that. Sometimes good enough is exactly good enough. And so you don't wait for perfection in order to prove that value out.
That's right. The world gets gray because I often think this. You have to make everything's a business decision because it's a business, and so. I've often sometimes had conversations with CISOs saying, look, you're a risk mitigator. That's all. You explain the risk to the general counsel, to the CEO, and to the CFO, and they make a decision. And the decision could be that Well, if we spend an extra 10 mil on this cybersecurity thing, right? That's $10 million, and that's very important because you've got shareholder value and blah blah blah, and employees to pay, and we obviously can't run out of money because people's lives are impacted. That's genuine. At the same time, it could be that the consequence of that breach we estimate at $8 million. Okay. Well, it sounds brutal, but we've got a $2 million, in the black, right, a decision to make. And I think the role of the CISO, and look, I've been in this game. I shave, so you can't see my gray whiskers. I've been in this game long enough, right? So, 15 years in cyber, 20 in security. I'm 49 years old, so I've seen a few things. Not the IBM mainframes that you mentioned. You got me there, Pat. So well done. But I remember the day when we picked up the phone receiver and put it on the modem. I was an English teacher back in the day, thinking this is going to change the world. So I go back that far, and we all grew up through the ranks as a bunch of geeks, as I like to say. I was a gadget geek. So how does an English teacher become who I am today? Well, it's purely because I love gadgets. I had a GPS on my bicycle that was this big before it was cool, right? Just because I wanted to measure, right? So I just wanted to measure distances cycling to work because I just love gadgets, and fell into cyber from being formerly in the police cadets and military. I like straight lines and order. It makes me feel secure. So I got sucked into this industry. Your career chooses you. People think it's the other way around. But because we grew up as a bunch of geeks in the ranks, I think that it's been challenging to communicate to CFO, CISO, not so much general counsel because they deal in risk, but the CEO is typically an MBA type. The CFO is typically a finance business type. This is not a ones and zeros person. Where so that crazy password thing we mentioned before works for the people who think in ones and zeros. I mean, I've got some colleagues at Checkpoint, they'll remember my IP address before my name kind of thing, right? I'm being sarcastic, but that's just a tail end of the bell curve amount of people, and they all live in Silicon Valley, right? Creating
know your audience,
stuff.
right? Know your audience and translate you can define a risk statement and then figure out what the risk is, but then you're going to have to translate it into terms that are understandable for the audience that's being presented to. So if it's going to the CFO or the CEO, then you need to translate it into revenue terms, and cost terms, or bottom line terms, profitability terms. So that's not that unusual. You have to know who your audience is and address them.
So let's finish on, I think, a nice big subject matter too. For the audience members watching this in the archive, there are probably a few CISOs, a lot of VP security types, and then some director types, and then there's some hand-on younger fellas that are eventually going to move into that CISO kind of rank. For those who actually have a charismatic, let's say, sales skill set, what advice would you give them to convince their organization to let them have a crack at a BISO role? We're still creating this thing, I think.
Yeah, in a lot of places you are. I mean, it's an industry. It's more mature in some industries. I say more mature only from the point of view that it's had longer tenure. Financial institutions have had BISOs for years. The difference is that BISO was in my opinion, a very kind of narrow swim lane of a turnstile between the line of business and the security to get security initiatives in place and to at least be able to have a conduit to feed business needs back up to security. But that was kind of the swim lane, and they stayed in it. When I was asked to build the BISO program, I kind of threw that away and said, yeah, that's something that we do, but that's a natural outcropping of the fact that we're a sales team for security as part of the business out to the clients and out to the customers. So the biggest thing, I think, the barrier to entry in technology has dropped significantly over the years for individuals. And the barrier to entry to security has dropped too. It may not appear that way, but there are lots of folks out there now, lots of CISOs that will tell you they're hiring for passion, drive, inspiration, desire. And they probably already have a technology background because they've been using technology their entire life as a young person.
Right.
So the barrier to entry now, so once you get into that security realm, be sure that you have a really solid understanding of all security. A person, in my opinion, that has been a pure engineering technical person in security and had no exposure to governance risk compliance is going to have difficulty being a BISO, because the vast majority of the work that's done with a client, working with a client, it surrounds that governance risk compliance area. Making the client feel comfortable that we're processing everything properly and so on and so forth. So that's the big one to me is make sure that you have a broad view of cyber, not just the technical only, and vice versa, not just the GRC only.
Right. Yeah. So are there programs out there that for training on BISOs? I mean, is it that well established yet, or is it still in its infancy? Where can we point people for education on this?
Yeah, I haven't seen any such program. I've talked to several people that said that would probably be an interesting program to put together. I think my advice would be to kind of do what I did, which is study to be a salesperson. Look at sales techniques, whether it be neuro-linguistic programming and NLP and reading body language, and look at various. There are tons of books out there that you can find on sales techniques and how to close and how to understand, pitching the story, telling the story. Storytelling is a huge part of being a BISO. I should be able as a BISO to take any topic, whether it be an incident occurred, or we want to put this initiative in place, or we want to go passwordless. I should be able to form that into a story that resonates with whoever the end audience is, and be able to adapt that story as I go. So storytelling is huge.
Damn, you're absolutely right. I didn't even think of that. What a beautiful maturity for the industry that we've been slugging in for me for 15 years and 20 in tech. But the fact that we've now matured to the place where storytelling is important is so wonderful to me. It means it's mainstream acceptance, right?
Yeah. And if you're trying to sell a BISO program, the hardest, the place that'll be hardest to sell a BISO program is if you have a CISO that is a really charismatic, dynamic salesperson already. Because because you got a CISO that can do that. So just take the CISO out with you. I don't need another person. Where you can sell it easier is when you go, the CISO is just, he's a wonderful CISO, drives the program, makes stuff happen internally, but I just would not put him in front of a client.
Right.
Now, all of a sudden you go, okay, well then give me a BISO or a deputy CISO/BISO.
Gotcha.
And that is that charismatic person, and use it as to fill in the gaps between people.
Yeah, internally and externally. Internally selling programs and externally selling them to customers. I would say the majority of CISOs are probably not charismatic enough to be BISOs. Is that a horrible thing to say? But I think so still.
Or they just may not like it. They may not like that kind of a situation, because they have not accepted the dark side and moving that way. And so, that's what you got to look for to round that out.
God, it's brilliant. It's really brilliant. Pat, this has been a really fun one for me. Very inspirational. I hope a lot of people watch it in the archive. As I say, maybe 1,600 people usually grab it in the first week. But what we'll do is I'll try and promote it a little bit, because in fact, I'll mention it on LinkedIn to a few CISOs that I know, should probably find the time to find this one. Right. And maybe just didn't dial in live today, because this has been a conversation that I think needs to stand in history for me as a turning point to say, yeah, the maturity of the industry is truly here. Here's a guy that's already out there doing it. You've still got the responsibility of the old role. So you're managing both in your case. So kudos, but yes, and at times this needs to split so that people can, dedicate themselves to one and the other, because one is truly a technologist and risk mitigator, and the other one has to know technology, understand risk mitigation, but be able to get people on the program, which is sales. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. Yeah.
Well,
Fantastic.
I had a great time. It's really good to be able to talk on these subjects.
Where can people find you on LinkedIn? What do they need to? If they go on LinkedIn, type in your name. There's probably a few that turn up. So what else should they type to find you?
Maybe. But if you do it as Patrick L, Benoit.
Okay.
That's the end of the URL. You do the LinkedIn/in/Patrick L. Benoit.
Perfect. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is go to linkedin.com. And if you just go / and go straight to somebody's profile name, Pat has managed to create his own Patrick L. Benoit. Questions there on, the in-mail messaging system, or just in the comments of this live stream. And if you if you mention us, it'll come up in our notifications. Be very happy to answer any questions in the future. I'm going to send this to a few people I definitely already have in mind. And hey, I'm really grateful for this, Pat. This was absolutely wonderful. I think this is probably a great place to stop it after 40 minutes.
Yeah. No, my pleasure. And when anybody reaches out, I'm happy to connect. Let me know. Mention the at this podcast, because otherwise I don't have context. And as you can imagine, I do get a few requests daily.
Yeah, well, thank you for jumping onto our show. So that's really appreciated, Pat.
Appreciate it.
Stay safe online, everybody. Patrick, thank you so much. You're a scholar and a gentleman. Greatly appreciated.
Cheers.